Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm going to share my screen, if I may. If I find, there we are. Okay, could you tell me whether you see my slide, please?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to what is clearly going to be a very interesting day on a ambitious and really cutting-edge dynamic microsimulation model. And I consider myself fortunate, and I'm proud that I've been able to add my 5 cents to this very interesting model. I'm going to, in my presentation, in my reaction, try to put the current model into a more an international setting to show you where this model is unique and where it is less unique. Both parts, I think, are important in the sense that you want a model that is unique and cutting edge, but on the other hand, there is not necessarily outside academics a need for a model that is completely different than anything else in the world. So I hope that I can show you both, and after that I'm going to give you some points which struck me when reading the documentation. I'm going to give you a number of points that I think the model is interesting, and I also going to put a number of question marks here and there. So first of all, and I think it's good to take a step back here, why microsimulation in the first place? Why would a country like Italy want to invest in a dynamic microsimulation model? Can't we do it with a macro model or even standard simulations? Well, the advantage of using microsimulation models is that it takes into account all the cross-sectional and longitudinal nonlinearities that are in existence, especially in pension systems. Usually you see that labor market categories and labor market histories tend to accumulate over the career, and that results in a pension benefit. And this, in the Italian pension system, is no stranger to this either. And it is very difficult to model these kind of nonlinearities outside microsimulation models. Furthermore, you have means tests which require additional income. You have boni and malai, which is something that in a way, it reinforces these longitudinal differentials between groups of individuals. You have minimum earnings, which are also highly nonlinear. And you have differentials in early or late earnings base. So for example, if in Belgium, I make a contribution to the pension system early in my career, it has a different impact than when I make this contribution later in my career. Now, this changes if you are in an NDC context, but even then, it can have profound impacts. Think, for example, of the current discussion that's going on in the Dutch pension system, where in the second pillar, the funded pillar, they're actually changing the impact of a earnings later in the career. They're reducing the impact to be more in line with actuarial actuarial impacts. So this is very important. Furthermore, dynamic microsimulation models, actually all microsimulation models, allow for modeling on the relevant policy level, and that can be the individual, but it can also be the household. And specifically think here of housing modeling, which is typically something that is done on the household level. It's very complicated to do that matching or joint modeling of households and individuals in any model outside microsimulation. Finally, in the risk assessments, if you have a semi-aggregate model or a macro model that does not include a specific group, so that does not model specifically for a specific group, let's say low educated immigrants from North Africa, then it can't assess those risks by definition. In a microsimulation model, it can, because the risk profiles are not ex ante determined. And finally, and that is the key element here, I think you can look beyond the aggregates. As I said, I gave you a number of examples, the means tested minima, the boni, the mali, but also you can simulate poverty and inequality. You can simulate the impact of changed household composition, for example, in survivor pensions. You can simulate the impact of assortative mating. Ricardo has told you something, has touched on the coupling of individuals in stable relations or in marriage. This is actually rather fundamental, and it is a difficult part in modeling. Finally, you can have these longitudinal effects, I already discussed those, and you can have low work intensity indicators. I will come back to that later. But just an example from our own simulations in Belgium, and I'm going to be brief because you're not particularly interested in Belgium, but rather in Italy. Still, I think it's relevant. We simulated the impact of changing the career requirement for early retirement. So we had a number of years that you had to have a minimum career in order to retire early. And with that, the policymakers, the politicians, increased this career threshold for early retirement with 2 years in 2017. And we saw that there was a normal impact on the retirement of men. That was to say, men retired 2 years later, so they had a higher retirement benefit, and everything was as expected. But for women, exactly the opposite came. We saw exactly the opposite, because the retirement benefit of women actually went down, and that was a surprise for us. And the answer turned out to be in the distribution of career length among women, which was absolutely not what one would expect from a normal distribution. So absolutely not like men, this nice, neat budge in orange, but actually it was dual. You had a number of women that had a very long, almost male type career. And I don't mean to say this in the subjective sense. They had long careers, almost always full-time work. And so they could retire early before the policy measure, but also after the policy measure. On the other hand of the scale, we had a large proportion of women which had very short career and which had worked part-time. And so these women could not go into early retirement before the policy measure and after the policy measure. So for women, actually what you saw was that this increase of the career requirement gave way to a selection effect where women that had a short career could not retire. Women that had a long career would retire anyway. And so you had, in the short run, this surprising selection effect. This we would not have seen if we would not have simulated taking into account the distribution of career length. In other words, any macro model would probably have missed this phenomenon. So my next step is to try to put some perspective in TDIM and compare it with other models that are being used outside academics in Europe. I'm not going to touch on the models that are being used inside academics because I think it is relevant for the Italian government to know which countries they meet in European context, which have models that are comparable or not comparable, like TDIM. And the first classification we need to do is make a difference between longitudinal aging and cross-sectional aging, or if you will, because in practice it coincides, between discrete time models, which is TDIM one of, and continuous time models. Continuous time models are, for example, those of the Czech Republic, of the ones of Slovenia, the Polish model, and they are almost always limited to pensions. They use huge data sets of register data, so basically like so administrative data, because they only have one individual at a time in their modeling core, and so they cannot or very difficultly simulate households. Neither can they or very difficultly simulate interactions between individuals. And that is a problem if, of course, you want to simulate, for example, poverty risks, or you wish to simulate household pensions. So most models that we see outside academics in Europe are of the cross-sectional discrete time type, which is the same with TDIM. So TDIM is in a family of models which is quite large, and the most renowned of those are the CSIM model in Sweden, Destiny model in France, PenSim in the UK. Well, this is a study of 2012. UK is no longer in Europe. Still, I think it's worthwhile to keep it in. And the models from the MIDAS family, which are very close, at least in the origin, to TDIM. And Portugal also is a model that fits into that family. But there's a difference here as well, because, for example, the Destiny model only focuses on pensions. The same goes for the LC model. Whereas, and Dynapor as well, the Portuguese model. Whereas other models like CSIM, PenSim2, MIDAS, and TDIM go beyond pensions and also aim to simulate household equivalent income, thereby giving way to simulations of poverty, of inequality, and redistribution. In other words, TDIM in its current form is, at least as far as I'm concerned, at the forefront with a number of models, including the renowned models of CSIM. Here, I'm going to gloss over this one. Here you see where all these models are being used. For example, I also included here the Norwegian model, Mozart of Statistic Norway, for two reasons. First of all, it is a model that is equally ambitious as TDIM in the sense that it includes a number of phenomena that other models do not have. Think of wealth, think of household composition, think of equivalent income. Migration is another one. And the same goes for the PenSim2 model, and but other models are sometimes even larger. Think of the PRISM model, which is the CNAV one here in France, which is basically the first pillar of pensions. And you have the Trajectoire model, which is basically the first and the second pillar of pensions, both in France. But these are only focusing on pensions. And so they do not attempt to simulate household income. TDIM uses LEAM2, of which I'm very proud to be able to say that I also added my 5 cents. LEAM2 is an open source modeling language specifically for dynamic models, and it allows TDIM to work in a international informal network, including the MIDAS models, the Institute of Policy Modeling of the Sorbonne University of Paris, which used the LEAM2 to make a model of the Agir pension system in France, which is basically the second pillar pension system in France. We also have the SLAM model in Slovakia. We have the Statistics Flanders regional model, which is, I think, interesting because it models regional migrations within the Flanders region at an extremely detailed level, and so it opens possibilities for TDIM and for us to maybe not follow them at the same level of detail, but still to learn from their experience and maybe able later on to model larger regions. The basic point here also, because TDIM is participating in the INGRID2 network, is that actually we learn from each other. And Ricardo also told you where I have been adding some of my experience in the earlier development of TDIM, but the other ways it works too. We learn from TDIM, for example, in their modeling of the cloning process of migration, and we learn from them in the modeling of wealth. And so this is not just fun, but it also gives way to economies of scale, which I think are important as well. Here you see the general structure of TDIM on the right. This is the slide that I actually stole from the presentation of Ricardo. And on the left, you see the general structure of my own model, MIDAS for Belgium. And you can see that in broad lines, it is basically the same. And this is because even if we constantly are putting into question this structure, and we should, because in a discrete time model, this is actually more important than we sometimes realize, we always come back to the same structure. And so in its fundamental structure, TDIM aligns to a long tradition of models. Actually, this structure you can trace back to one of the oldest models around, which is the Brookings model in the United States, somewhere in the 70s. On its fundamental level, things have not changed that much. The fundamental changes are in the technical issues, in the nuts and the bolts, and in the scope of the model. Finally, alignment. As do many models, and mine is no exception, TDIM uses alignment extensively, for example, to include information from the aging working group, but also to include information from Statistics Italy. And this actually is more a discussion, especially with academic partners, than it would seem at first glance. The reasons for alignment, I believe, are strong. For example, to use policy-relevant external information. With our models, if you use aging working group information, you can actually paint a picture that is consistent with the aging working group projections, while at the same time putting the focus on, for example, poverty and inequality. And I know quite a few countries that wish that they would have a model like that, because then they could show the outside world, yes, but if you follow these, for example, you can show that the financial sustainability of pensions does this and that, but on the other hand, the impact of poverty is going to be this and that. Financial and social sustainability of social security systems are generally seen as being two sides of the same coin, and so it's interesting if a model can capture both. And alignment gives this possibility. It also allows to overcome a number of technical issues, notably in the simulation properties of logistic regression equations. We use logistic regression equations a lot to simulate transitions. The problem is that a lot of these transitions, especially in the demographic model, are rare. One does not necessarily divorce every day. One does not necessarily marry every day. One does not necessarily leave the household every day. And so these transitions often covered by logits are sometimes rare, and we know that the simulation properties of logistic regressions in the corner of the distributions are not necessarily very good, and that is one of the reasons why we use alignment in order to prevent our model going in all kinds of directions which are not necessarily realistic. And it allows us to work with other specialized teams, think of demographers, to again paint a comprehensive picture. But it also has a number of downsides. For example, it gives way to information dependence. If you use alignment information for your base scenario, let's say information from the working group, the aging working group, and the variant is not included by the aging working group, then it's very complicated to make a variant in the same field. You would almost need to have the same models as the aging working group in order to change your alignment table. So that is a bit of a risk. It hinders you in the development of simulation variants. Also, and here, this is a focus of the critics sometimes from the academic field, and they are not necessarily wrong. Sometimes it looks a bit like clipping the wings of a bird, especially if you combined alignment with a structural decision modeling. And the classic example, I myself once made a Arbeger-Dachsvik continuous time structural labor supply model, which went into a certain direction, was all good and fine. And then I had to combine that with alignment, which basically means that I could use this fancy labor supply model only to simulate the intensive labor market decision and not the extensive labor market decision. And I got a lot of flack for that, and for good reason so, because it was really using a fabulously good Arbeger-Dachsvik model to simulate a decision which at the end was fairly irrelevant in the light of the simulation results on the whole. And finally, it would be good, and there are some signals that there are interesting steps going on at the moment, but it would be interesting to have higher order effects in these alignment tables. So basically more structural modeling in the alignment tables in order to change the fact that in its core, a microsimulation model is a reduced form model, and it can be criticized for that. Finally, allow me to give you, bring you a couple of points where I feel that the new TD model is really cutting edge and gaining new ground, and I think they have to be applauded for that. This team went out of its way to make a very interesting model, and in some ways, other development teams can learn from them. One of them is obviously migration, and they have told you about that extensively and for good reason. It's a very interesting development. Actually, the two teams, that is my own team and the TDIM team, have been working more or less in parallel on this. It is, in our team, it is also ready, but it's not yet in the official version of our model. And the reason is that we got stuck with the modeling of foreign pensions. That is, people that enter the country, let's say at the age of 40, and that are originating from another EU member state, they more often than not have a foreign pension. And we do not have enough data of good quality to take those foreign pensions on board. And so we are still working on that. And I was wondering whether the TDIM team could say a few words on how they handled that for us very difficult problem. The correction of self-employment income is something very interesting. I haven't seen that often before, at least not in the context of dynamic microsimulation. So it's something that I will need to study in more detail later on. Something else that struck me was the submodule for working pensioners. Now, this is something that is increasingly becoming relevant because other countries also, many countries actually, allow for pensioners to continue working, and in some cases even upbuilding of pension claims after retirement. And so I was wondering how they did this. Is it based on behavioral equations, whether somebody continues to work after retirement? Is this aligned? If it is aligned, how does this match with the overall alignment of the labor market module? I think this is an interesting and striking new development. Next, I think maybe these two are interrelated, but the simulation of private pensions, which apparently is included in TDIM. This is something that I have been doing much work myself, and to date without much success. The problem is not just to simulate who has private pensions. These are usually not very high proportions of the population, at least not in Belgium. But if they are high populations, the proportions, then what are the amounts? And again, we are working here, at least in Belgium, with fairly low amounts. So you really reach the corners of what you can do in a stochastic simulation here. And so it was interesting in learning how the TDIM team resolved this issue. The same goes for financial wealth. I know a bit more about this because I know the work of Simone Tedeschi in the model CAPDIN. I don't know whether you read the original paper. It's very interesting, albeit very, very complex. And so I'll be very interested in learning more about the financial wealth decision. And especially, I would like to know where there is a crowding out, whether you assume or model a crowding out between private pensions, financial wealth, and savings module, because this is a complex issue, many higher order effects, many redistributive effects. I mean, you can imagine that people at the low end of the distribution do not save at all, whereas people at the high end of the distribution do. So there are a lot of higher order effects at play here, and I would be very interested in learning more about that probably after this workshop. Housing wealth is another thing where, and here I believe that TDIM is really cutting edge. It's gaining new ground. It's not that other models do not have that. The Swedish CSIM model has had housing wealth since the early 2000s, but it is a rather, let's say, simple, if not simplistic, way of modeling. And I'm very curious to learn how the Italian team did this, also because the proportion of people having, or households, sorry, housing is done on the household level, the proportion of households having two or houses is comparatively high in Italy. So it would be interesting to learn about that, and especially whether the team modeled joint households or joint housing possession. You can imagine that a extended family, that is various households that are related through bloodlines, have joint possession of a house somewhere in the countryside that previously was owned by the mater and pater familias, and so was given to them through inheritance. And so, and I immediately touch another interesting point here, which is the transmission over of or before death. I'm going to come to that later. So I was wondering whether they modeled that explicitly or not. Another point is, and I'm not sure how important it is in the Italian context, but if they model housing wealth, does that also mean that they model the rent market? Especially for young households, I think that is an important part, and renting can be a relevant field of policy. Next step, and I think this again is very interesting, and I think other teams should learn more about what the Italian team did, is the inter vivos transmissions and the inheritance. Sorry?
I'm sorry.
Can I continue? Is anybody here?
Yes, we were asking if you can close your presentation in a couple of minutes, otherwise there is no time for the second speaker.
Yeah, I will close. I'm sorry, I took too much time. I'll close it very rapidly. So these inter vivos inheritance are very interesting, and I think I would like to learn more about those. One final point, and I'm going to close down. An obvious thing that I haven't seen is the low work intensity indicator. This is an official indicator on the EU level. It describes the AROPE indicator, and it would be, given the structure of TDIM, it would be very easy to include that, and I would invite the team to do so. So apologies for taking too much time, and this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Hayes Deckers. No problem. It's a common thing that happens on such meetings. I would like to give you an answer to all your questions, but very broadly, and then I'm going to give the floor to Maria Luisa Maitino, who's got all the time in the world, but if we can keep to 15-20 minutes. So thank you very much, Hayes, for your presentation that gives us an overview of other models, which we did not do. And your presentation gives me the chance of thanking you and your team and all the entire network, Liam too, and Ingrid, because really this model is really a joint effort also at the international level. Some innovative aspects which have been included in this model, migration, and also the inclusion of a multinomial in the choice of occupational career is the result of cross consultations. And I'm very happy that some aspects related to gender have emerged in the Belgian model, because we will get back to it during our panel number 3. Hayes spoke about internal migration as another models, and this allows me to specify something that I did not mention before. Or maybe I did. The TD model at the moment only speaks about international migration, so there is no structure in terms of local bodies. There is just Italy. So all individuals within Italy are part of no region or no specific municipality. As far as working pensioners, well, this is one of the innovations that were called for by the project, and we will get back to that aspect during panel 2, but no doubt we simulated specific dynamics for working pensioners because, of course, they are not analogous to the behaviors of other workers. And as far as alignment, though, as far as is concerned, is still as the AVG employment rate up to 75 years of age, so we can still continue to use the alignment. As far as wealth and private pensions, I understand that you are curious because this is perhaps the main innovation at the level of TD modeling modules, sorry, and that is why our team signed a cooperation agreement with the University of Roma Tre, and among the people involved there is also Simone Tedeschi that you mentioned and that you know, of course, and who has worked with us at the development of the wealth module. So also in this connection, we are united our forces. And in panel 3, there is also Professor Mazzaferro among the discussants, who's one of the fathers of CAPDIN, so we are all here speaking about TD. So, without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Maria Luisa Maitino. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this workshop. And I think I'm speaking on behalf of the entire group.
Actually, when we say the group, it seems that there are so many of us, but actually I'd like to congratulate all of you for your extraordinary work so far. And that was really quick, because I remember when we met, it was 1.5 years ago. And I remember that the issue 3.0 of the team had to be implemented. And of course, you are not working 100% on the implementation of the model. So congratulations for that. And by reading the papers published so far, well, I have a lot of items I'd like to deepen and a lot of questions I'd like to ask you. Because I believe it's always interesting to share methods and knowledge. And 2 years ago, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of INPIT, during the workshop for the presentation of the static and dynamic models developed within the Institute, we thought that it would be useful and interesting to have a network, also because there are many of us now. And of course, I'm sure this is going to be a long-term approach, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot of occasions to share views. and also occasions to exchange views, as we are doing already with the budget office. And on that occasion, we've had a lot of occasions to share views. So today I'll focus on the 3 items that you have suggested to us. That is to say, on calibration and on the alignment, as well as on the migration module. So I'll start with the calibration, and I start with a method approach. That is to say, on the choice you made on the reweighting at an individual level. Over the time, we had used an independent procedure, and that entailed misalignments, especially when, for instance, we were sharing results on the distribution policies at the household level versus the individual level. But then, with the passing of time, we have implemented a calibration procedure which is a supplementary one and which takes into account a number of household and individual variables. So, of course, this is quite slower in terms of conversion, and it is also more complex, but it guarantees that the weight of the household and of the individuals that make up the family coincide. And of course, this is a feature that was required under the regulation of the Commission for silk surveys, and it's not entirely changing the original design of the sampling of the silk. And furthermore, this calibration allows to align at the same time by households and individuals the weights and align with all of the constraints we took into consideration, because it includes the individual characteristics that we want to refer to. And also, it also considers all of the ways and weights at the same time, both the families and the households, and that have those features as those that don't. After the reweighting and the expansion of the sample, you are only considering, for instance, the families. And in the report, I write, for instance, the heads of the family. So once they're extracted, all of the individuals follow. And as I said, it is not clear to me, and it was not clear to me, what happens with the family individuals that have different weights as compared to the head of the family. So this is a way of playing with words, but in concrete, in practice, if my husband, after the reweighting, has a weight of 100 and my weight is 120, what happens with the others? So I was wondering whether the representation of the sample with the reweighting is kept or not. Based on our experience, then, we used the reweighting on the static model only because with the dynamic model, we realized it was necessary to adopt let's say a more fine-tuned approach. What I mean is the distribution by age of the population had some gaps. That is to say, we had a concentration of 45ers male and an underestimation of men aged 42, for instance. So for this reason, we had a number of distortions in terms of mortality flows, or, for instance, retirement flows. So we realized that it was more suitable to expand the sample and then to work on age and professional condition in order to get an alignment, almost perfect alignment, with the population at the beginning of the period. So I was wondering whether, for instance, you found this problem also with the calibration according to age brackets, because I read that the constraints relate to age brackets. And also, I have a number of questions relating to some clarifications. Actually, I was curious to know how many constraints had been introduced, for instance, within the calibration. And also, another item, that is to say, after the explosion of the sample, you got the entire population by exploding the weights. And that is the reason why you needed to select the 100 samples for computational reasons, I guess. So, our idea for a possible solution was that of considering the minimum weight of the sample. So before the exposure, we set new parameters relating to the weights of the samples to the minimum threshold, and therefore each record for us has a value that equals the minimum of the value of the sample, and all the others were reset in consideration of the minimum threshold. For this reason, we got 533,000 individuals within the sample exploded. As regards the alignment, well, this is quite complex as a topic. Based on the papers, I've not always been able to understand what is the alignment methodology that we can use, whether there's, for instance, a random approach, and I'd like to know, in this case, what is the level of amendment and correction and adjustment you had to introduce each time, and if you took into consideration the distortions of the alignment procedure. So, for instance, I am thinking that we recently used a re-ranking procedure to simulate the effects of the pandemic in 2021, and then so on poverty. And we also enforced unemployment rates, and we aligned to the unemployment values of ISTAT in the quarters of 2020 by using a re-ranking procedure. So we used this approach by considering that there was a ban to dismiss employees for the open-ended contracts and employees. So there was no distortion at all, because we could only dismiss open-ended workers that are less likely to be unemployed. So I was wondering, in case there was no condition in terms of impossibility to dismiss or to retire, then the unemployment flows would be distorted, right? And we would concentrate the entire unemployment situation among the fixed-term employees. So a re-ranking is truly complex to develop if we want to keep the distribution of laws among the states, among the countries. And in any case, we are supporting validation because I wouldn't exclude it irrespective of the alignment, because aligning to, for instance, mortality rates or birth rates, this is not eliminating the real flows at all, in the sense that by aligning to birth rate and by considering birth rate as you do with a logistic approach, depending on the characteristics of women, it is not sure that the flow of newborns corresponds to the real one, although, of course, you are linked to the total birth rate. And it will be interesting also to see validation of, for instance, all of those dimensions that were not aligned. And I was thinking about, for instance, the unemployment rate or also the retirement rates. And I end up with a migration module. And of course, it is necessary in the dynamic macro simulation schemes. And here I have two questions. One relates to cloning and how it is carried out. And I think there's an eligibility criterion that needs to be considered when it comes to, for instance, the families. And the incoming flows generally have characteristics that differ from, for instance, resident households, because, for instance, those families already had a family reunification or rejoining process. So some years ago, when we started with the dynamic model, and I remember the first version was at a regional level, then the flows, the migration flows, were somehow consistent both in relation to the regions, because the Tuscany region was attractive, as it happened for the other regions of Italy, and also in the at the beginning, ISTAT used to provide us with detailed information, for instance, from the balance sheets of municipalities of the migration flows, and actually, we had data for the Tuscany region only, whereas the incoming flows were quite different from the ones relating to resident population and from the households that were migrating at the moment. So the cloning has to specifically focus on the main characteristics of the individuals that you let in. And then it would be interesting also to see the results. And I open the slide now, but I'm referring to the results and also for instance, the dependency rate and also the average age. Hence, in this case, without any migration information, we would need to see what is the contribution in terms of flows by foreign individuals. So their impact on the aging of population and also the dependency rate and index. Because, of course, we all know that the structure of population in 2050 is already clear nowadays based on the evolution in the past and in the last few years, and based on how the population is structured now. But then the fact of identifying how many foreign people we need in order to keep this aging of population constant and also the sustainability of the entire welfare system, well, I believe this is definitely interesting. I think I asked too many questions, and I thank you once again for inviting us to participate. Thank you. I see that Irene is probably going to ask us to close the session because we are running out of time, but we'll try and comply with the agenda. I'll try and answer to your questions in a general way, but then I'm sure we'll have contacts in order to analyze these aspects in detail. It's interesting, the reweighting and also granular approach as well, but I don't think that our procedure is so fine-tuned now. And for instance, as regards the access to retirement, despite of our sample is quite large now, well, this information tells us that probably the problem is that one. That is to say, we start from a sample that is the one linked to SILP, 48,000 individuals that we are expanding, but that was the starting point anyway. So this is very interesting. And then maybe Stefano can deepen this. As to the alignment, well, considering the level of the correction, because when it comes to the alignment, but this is the issue to be considered when it comes to the dynamic approach, well, this must be done during the validation phase, but at the moment we are actually carrying out the validation, but also when it comes to the result we're going to prepare, we cannot show to you any alternative scenarios or scenarios without the alignment, but it is worth, first and foremost, especially when it comes to the employment, if we align the employment to the rates, so what happens and what happens with our model. And as to migration, well, maybe a couple of words are needed in this connection. You're right. We consider the problem of not representing the households are too different from the access ones, but the idea relating to the algorithm we're using is, of course, the reference is a household, but we control it by variables and individual components. This means that if the alignments tell me, as it is quite sure, that you need to have a lot of male, for instance, that aged 30, then the alignment allows, since you have to select several male aged 30 than women, and since you cannot be wrong, you're going to select a lot of singles among the ones already included in the sample that we have, and therefore there will be a cloning relating to single male. So as to the representativeness of the households, we rely on the Chavar algorithm, and we have a number of alignments, and then we check that the households of migrants are different from the non-migrant ones, and this is something we checked actually. Also the selection of the size of our sample, which is 200,000 households and 400,000 individuals, is based on the minimum level that we need in order to have a representativeness of the migration phenomenon. Okay, that's clear. Okay, thank you. And actually, we also had a number of charts, but if we go below 200,000 households, we're going to have errors. I agree on showing the sensitivity scenario on the demographics. And of course, the sensitivity scenarios are the ones that we're going to do for sure, because this is part of the validation process, hence to see whether the model is consistent. And that's it, I guess, for me. I don't think that there's too much time for Stefano. Sorry to interrupt you. Maybe we can just ask whether there are questions for the streaming, and then we close this panel. So we succeed in having 5 minutes break. So, Marco Cacciotti raised his hand. Hello. Just a question. I don't know whether it's a technical question, and I don't know whether it's grounded. I hope you can hear me. I saw you start from 2016, and for the silk waves, and also the data from IMSS. But as a base year, you consider 2016. So my question mainly concerns the fact that then using the information you collect for 2017, are you checking whether there's a consistency for the subsequent year in terms of forecast or not? Because it will be interesting to see whether the sample actually represents if it has a structure able to collect the information relating to 2017, which is actually not used. Well, the answer is short. As a matter of fact, what we do, well, we consider still 2016, and since the information concerns the tax return for the previous year, we take the sample back to 2015. So the validation is directly made in 2016 because we go back to 2015 and then in 2016 we validate. It is possible to do that for 2017 as well, but we didn't do that because this is part of the ongoing validation. What we did actually was to have a look at the institutional results at the macro level. But then, of course, we can grasp this opportunity, and since we get additional micro information, which are subsequent to the ones collected for our base year, and we can, of course, do that for 2017 as well. Now, any other questions, if any? Okay, let's break for 5 minutes, and we can, I don't know, we probably have it. Is there an alignment relating to the structure of population by level of education and the possible future assessment of the structure? Quick answer, yes is the answer. We align by level of education, and we are using ISTAT data, and we align the level of university education and also upper secondary school. And then the residual information is the lower, let's say, secondary education. So the alignment is done based on ISTAT data, and the level of education for the time being is kept constant. But of course, these alignments are easy to move, and although, of course, there's been a squeezing recently. And then we make an assumption, for instance, to consider the graduation age, to consider which age we are leaving the education pathway, but then there's nothing to add. Thank you, and I'd like to thank the discussants for their contributions. 5 minutes break, and then we'll be back with the second panel. Okay, so I'll start if you all agree. Say good morning. I'll chair this session, and there are going to be two different presentations, always relating to the model. So the first one is by Chiara, and this relates to the situation of the labor market, and then Michele Bavaro. And I'd like to grasp the opportunity to refer to the past events of this project, which I'm part of through the Brosolini Foundation, because in the midterm report, many of the things you see today and in the first days of the lockdown and with the difficulties, well, those that want to get additional information are more than welcome. The discussants for this session include, and I read in alphabetical order, Paolo Acciari from the Finance Department, an expert in taxation and the labor market. Then we have Federico Bellotti, University Professor at Tor Vergata University of Rome, and he knows this mode as well. And the third speaker is Giovanni Gallo, that at the moment is carrying out that research activity with me, and he's an expert in microsimulation. So to stick to the time, well, the two presentations I ask you to please stick to the 15 minutes so that we're going to have a 10 minutes debate, and then we have more time for the debate among discussants and the authors of the report. So, Chiara? I will just take the floor in case you're exceeding the time allotted. Thank you. Okay, I accept this challenge, and I'll promise I'll stick to the schedule. So in this panel, we're going to refer to the main innovations relating to the previous model, and we will see the structure of the IDSilk data, and we will have an overview on the evidence gathered within the labor market, and then we will present some of the results deriving from the econometric estimates, and which represent the input from the microsimulation model, and we will briefly talk about the future implementations. So what are the main novelties as to in relation to the previous version? Well, we have now the retired and students. And in this case, for instance, we had after assigning a work status, retired workers and also monthly wages were estimated. So sequential estimates were considered. And let us now consider IDSilk. And of course, this has been presented by Riccardo and Stefano before, and it represents an asset in terms of information, which is quite unique when it comes to the labor market, because it matches, as you know, information relating to the IMSS side and, of course, the individual's stories, and the information relating to the IDSilk survey. And then we can gather information relating to the social and economic conditions of both individuals and households. So now we are presenting a very short overview relating to the main evidence that allows us to have a picture of the labor market as from 2004 to 2017. And differently from what was done in the midterm report, here of course, Silk leads the way. So for each year, we've gathered only the subjects that were interviewed in the relevant wave, and then we've also listed the specific information and employment information. So here we see the progressive aging of the population, And if we consider it from the policy standpoint, it gives us an important information, mainly as to the growth of the age class, that is to say 65-74 in terms of age bracket. Let us now consider the level of education. And we see that those that have a degree, let's say a lower degree, are reduced versus those that have an upper degree. And then the migrants. So the presence of migrants in the labor market, of course, against a number of migration flows that vary, we see a progressive increase of the presence of migrants in the labor market. And if we observe the period 2004-2015, well, those migrants are increasingly educated. Then if we consider the ratio between, for instance, the type of contracts, you see the increase in the number of professionals and offset by a progressive reduction of crafts and traders. Let's see something which will not be surprising. That is to say, women are more frequently associated to open-ended contracts with the public administration, and men are mostly craftsmen, traders, and farmers. And of course, if you consider the level of education, you see that the level of education is linked to a fixed, an open-ended contract with the public administration or professionals. It's also interesting to see the monthly wages and median monthly earnings, full-time workers, and median annual earnings, full-time workers. So if you consider the monthly wages and the annual wages, well, the crucial aspect is represented by the type of employment. That is to say, how long a worker can work during the year. Let us deepen this aspect now, and we consider the number of days worked per year, full-time workers, and here there's a polarization between, for instance, let's say permanent and non-permanent jobs, and women work less days, and this is the distribution between men and women. And also an important aspect is that, for instance, the level of education helps to work longer. So this is a problem that concerns the dichotomy, young people, less young people. And now I'm part of the less young people at the moment. So, of course, this is a problem linked to the possibility to access the labor market, and also the migrants that overall work less days versus those that were born in Italy. And now, let us consider the transition matrices that are a summary of what we observe, and we've been observing from one year to the other. And this is also considered from the dynamic standpoint, 2005-2006 versus 2015-2016. So by comparing these matrices, we see an increase in the number of those that leave the labor market after 1 year. If we also consider the subsequent item, we see that the transitions after 2 years, and this aspect that worsens, and mainly those that have an open-ended contract.
In the last slide, we can see that the fact of having a higher educational level protects workers from the risk of exiting the labor market. So I hope I did not exceed the time that was given me, and I will give the floor to Chiara, who's going to illustrate the part concerning the econometric estimates that were used as an input in the micro-simulation model. Can you see the slides? Yes. So I will speak about the estimates concerning the labor market module. This is part of the microsimulation TD model, and it comes after the demographic module. What are the features of this labor market module? First of all, we have identified what we define as active age population. So as Elena was saying to start with, in this version of the model, we also included working pensioners. Then, through a logistic regression, we have assigned the probability of being employed on the labor market, which is also aligned. And those who are assigned to a status outside of a labor market can be recipients of disability benefits, unemployment benefits, or other forms, while those who are employed are further divided into various occupational categories. There can be permanent, private and public employees, temporary workers, atypical workers, professionals, self-employed, including artisans, traders, retailers, farmers. Additionally, in the case of employed workers, there is also another process which follows a logical model with which we assign those who work on a part-time or full-time basis, while in the case of temporary employees or atypical workers, they are assigned a number of months worked. These processes only concern these two occupational types, because in the case of the others, we assume that they work throughout the year. Then, in the case of all occupational categories, the one I've illustrated, we also estimate randomly their real monthly wages. Okay, let us look at the details of the estimates that we are developing within this model. The first estimate has to do with the probability of being employed. Something I want to say beforehand concerning estimates is that also in these regression models, we include as variables only variables that are also projected within the microsimulation model. And this in order to maintain a certain level of consistency among individual heterogeneity, which is considered by the estimates, and then what is simulated within the model itself. In this first slide, I will present the logical model, so the probability of being employed, and we can see that by grouping the variables in socio-demographic characteristics and characteristics related to the labor market, we can see that some features, some categories are at a disadvantage on the labor market, particularly when we look at students, pensioners, mothers with young children, so below 6 years of age, and those who, the disabled people, a condition defined based according to individual health or based on being the recipient of some IMSS benefit. Positive characteristics concerning the probability of being employed is being a foreigner, particularly if born in a non-EU country. This is in line with expectations because these are groups that, in order to be able to stay on their national territory in Italy, well, they need permits that are related to their occupational status. And then as age increases, and so does, and if education increases, this also increases the probability of being employed and also having a working partner. While we can see that being part of a couple is something positive for males, and it's not positive for females. It's in line with the literature that we have concerning salary estimates. Then if we look at the variables related to the labor markets, we can notice that, as we expected, as being outside of the labor market, well, this represents a probability of being less employed. And then regardless of the occupational experience previously gained, based on which one was employed on the labor market, this is positive, and it is related to the probability of being employed, particularly if in the year before we have considered the person was employed with an open-ended contract, or was a professional, or was a self-employed worker. As to the multinomials based on which we establish the probability of belonging to a given occupational category, this is also gender-based, I will try to present more specifically these tables that I realize at first may seem very complicated, but then the idea behind these tables is to look at every coefficient, particularly in terms of signs, in connection with the contract category, the reference category, which is that of private employed persons with an open-ended contract. So open-ended private. All the numbers with a minus sign show that people have a smaller probability of belonging to that category, and the reverse is true in case of a positive figure. There are some socio-demographic categories, such as those that we see above, that have a higher probability of working with an open-ended contract in the private sector than all other occupational categories. While there are other categories which are older age and higher education that have a higher probability of being part of another occupational category different from open-ended private, except for people with closed-term contracts. Then if we look at the previous experience accumulated on the labor market, gain on the labor market, what we can note is that when experience increases in any of the occupational categories concerned, the trend is that this causes an increase in the permanence in the same professional category in which the experience was gained. And this is the case for all occupational categories, particularly employed persons with an open-ended contract. There are also some transitions that can be observed and that exist for employed workers, closed-term versus open-ended contracts between the private and the public sector, depending on the sector one belongs to. And we can also notice that among the categories of self-employed workers, professionals, and co, there are various situations in the sense that when experience increases as a self-employed worker, what increases is not just the probability of remaining a self-employed worker, but also of becoming a fixed-term worker or co. The same goes for professionals who can turn to in co or public employees with an open-ended contract, or atypical workers that can turn into fixed-term workers. In the case of women, the situation is similar to what I just described for men, with the further information that having children in an age between 0 and 6 years of age increases the probability of working with private sector contracts of the open-ended type, except for self-employed workers. And as far as the experience gained in the past in the labor market, what we notice that is different compared with males is that women, when they work as professionals or as co, in some cases show transitions which are slightly better than what we notice in the case of males, because when experience increases as professionals do not lead to co contracts as it is the case with men, but only in the case of women, they tend to become public, open-ended employed workers. In the case of co, they can turn into fixed-term contracts, but also in public sector employees with an open-ended contract. If we look at the estimates of monthly wages, here I will only present what is related to private sector employees, which is a single estimate for closed-end and open-ended contracts. And this is just an example for all the estimates that we have made, because many of the dynamics that I illustrate here are also true for other occupational professional categories. Again, we can make a distinction among the variables, socio-demographic features, and those that are related to the labor market. And here too, we can highlight some features that have a negative influence on salary levels, particularly being foreigners, which on the one hand increases the possibility of being employed, but with lower wages compared with the Italian average. And the fact of being a mother of children who are very young or children who are slightly older, showing a penalty related to motherhood, which does not disappear right after the birth, and the fact of working on a part-time basis, while some factors can have a positive impact on salary. For instance, being a father, having a higher educational degree, having a partner who works, the amount of professional experience gained in the past, the presence of an open-ended contract versus a fixed-term contract. Now, if we look at the estimates concerning number of months worked, here too, we can divide between socio-demographic characteristics and those related to the labor market. Here too, the characteristics for which we have a negative sign in relation to months as being a student or retired, having a fixed contract in the private sector or a co contract versus having a fixed contract in the public sector. The features that are related to a higher number of months worked throughout the year are being a foreigner, being a father, having a higher educational level, and as expected, also a greater experience gain on the labor market, or a fact of also having worked during the year before. In connection to what I've illustrated so far, we have already thought about future implementations we want to carry out, and particularly concerning the regression models. We want to widen the recourse to RE models, that we tend to prefer compared with fixed models, because they allow us to maintain some characteristics such as country of birth, which in the case of the immigration module is important, and also because they allow us to make a significant estimate of variance at individual aspects, which is necessary for us to be able to attribute individual aspects also to individuals who are outside of the estimates. And additionally, we wish to also look at literature in connection to some economic relationships we are considering. It would be good to also introduce, like in introducing some variables such as being an employed worker, also considering another component concerning error, which can be a complex thing because we have an unbalanced panel, but that also presents observations that in some cases are different. And we could also add some additional processes that concern being able to distinguish unemployed persons from those who are outside of the labor markets, and try to develop these processes and estimates separately. In the case of individuals who only have one relevant contract throughout the year, and those who have got more than one. So with this, my presentation ends, and I would like to give the floor to my colleague who is going to look at the wealth module. Thank you, Chiara. So we give the floor to Michele. So I would like to ask Michele to stick to 15 minutes because, of course, we all have got to go for lunch. So, yes, I only have one problem with my presentation, actually sharing the slides, because I read here, Riccardo Conti presents. I don't know, maybe Chiara or Elena could share the screen. So if Chiara has closed their presentation, then Michele should be able to load, well, to share his. Well, I can still read Riccardo Conti presents, but I'm not doing anything, I promise. Well, if you want, I can perhaps share the screen, or I can leave, and perhaps the best thing is that Chiara could share the slides and she can just move on to the next when you ask her to. So you have to open the wealth presentation. Consider that you're not going to recover the time that we are wasting, so please consider that time is limited. Well, I could also begin by just speaking off the cuff. I apologize. I'm almost there. Bear with me. Or else I can share the screen because you sent me the slides. So let's see if Chiara manages. So in the meantime, while we wait, I can perhaps begin. So I have this task of describing to you the wealth module that, as you said, is one of the innovations in this new version of TDIM. Thank you, Chiara, for sharing the slides. And the structure of the presentation is quite typical. I will be speaking to start with. So I'm going to present data concerning wealth, then the structure of the wealth module, which is based on the work by Simone Tedeschi that was already mentioned. Simone is also connected, so perhaps later he can also add something. While in the final part, I will focus on two specific processes, which is that of consumption and financial investments, to then end by illustrating the preliminary results of the simulation. So, to start with, we can focus we can speak not just about wealth, but also about a submodule, which is that of private pensions, that we consider to be an additional component of the wealth module. So let us look at some initial definitions to sort of place this within a context. So by the net wealth of a family, we consider real wealth, financial wealth, to which we have to subtract liabilities. As real wealth, we only consider houses, whereas financial wealth can be divided into 4 types, which is liquidity, government bonds, corporate bonds, and stocks. So let us begin by looking at data. Well, the first thing we need to say is that, well, the data are collected and analyzed at household level in this specific module, the wealth module. So it is an element that separates it from the rest of the TD model. So house wealth is based on the data provided by the Department of Finance with 2 sources, cadastre and tax returns. From the cadastre, we have gained the value of the bill of the property, and from the tax returns, the way in which they are used. So for every silk model, we've got a house wealth. There is a deterministic matching, and this was compared also with macro aggregates from the Bank of Italy and the Department of Finance concerning the total house wealth in Italy. And also it was compared with the SHIY microdata, with which we can compare. We can see that the Gini index, there is an increase in the Gini index in administrative data versus the Gini in the SHIY, and that is related to a particular element in the sense that the number of families, households possessing 2 houses or more is much higher than what you would find. This is a typical result when you compare administrative data with other data. As to financial wealth, we see that we have a statistical matching between the silk data and the SHIW data, the study of the Bank of Italy. In this case, the data set, the donor data set, is the SHIW, and what the recipient is silk. So for every household, we've got a relative value which is related to financial wealth on the baseline here. The methodology we used is that of the propensity score matching, and in this connection there was a problem which is well known in literature, which is that of the underreporting of financial wealth data in the SHIW in terms of possession and value. This problem was analyzed during the literature that I mentioned, Barandolini and Taurizio, that make corrections. We do not make any correction to the base year, but this is one of our goals for the future, working on this. So we can continue rapidly by showing where our wealth module is placed within the various TD modules, after the pension module, but before the tax benefit module. But before we get into the wealth module, let us speak about the private pension sub-module, which is between the pension and the wealth modules, in between, in a sense. So the private pension sub-module, differently from the wealth one, is individual. So for every individual, we simulate the choice whether to participate to the second or third pillar. The second is, or the third, like third being private pensions. So the second pillar is fondi negoziali, and the third pillar coincides with fondi aperti o piani individuali pensionistici. This is based on the SHIY data. So investments in these alternative pension funds. Okay, the investments in the second or third pillar provide a certain return that is computed using COVID data when available 2016-19, whereas for 2020-50 we use simulations based on the composition of the pension fund composition, on the composition of the pension fund. So let us continue with the structure of the wealth module per se. So we can start from top to bottom to look at the processes that are interconnected really, and very briefly we can point at the main ones, which are the number one, private wealth transfers, which can be inter vivas or through bequest. Then there is the update of net wealth, real and financial. Then there is house ownership. Then there are financial investment processes, so how to invest financial wealth. And finally, point 5 and 6 are connected with each other. For instance, the choice of the household on how much to consume, so consumption, this leading to savings, which in the chart is connected, because what is saved becomes the next year financial wealth. So this is one of the assumptions in the module and in the model. Another relevant assumption which we make is related to returns, which vary over time, but that do not vary in terms of space among households. And we should also highlight that the only form of liability in this model and in this module is that of mortgage, which is related to investment in the property sector, whereas you cannot, it does not consider, for instance, taking loans for consumption purposes. So the next part is still related to estimates and alignments. Estimates are based on the SHIW macro data, and they can be two types. When we must simulate discrete choices, we use logit models, as in the case of choosing or to buy or sell a house, while in the case of quantities, we use continuous or log continuous regressions. For instance, how much the house bought is worth. As far as alignments are concerned, we use several sources. And for instance, we start from ISTAT for the total number of houses bought and sold, and also the saving rate. The Department of Finance gives us data on the number of rented houses. So this was not present in the outline, in the flowchart that I showed you before, but in the model we also module this process. COFIP for participants in the second and third pillars, pension schemes. And then there are also return rates on financial investments following projections by AWG, OECD, etc. So let us move on with one of the two specific focuses. The first concerns consumption processes. And initially I will be speaking about estimates. So estimates are based on panel data of the SHIW 2002-2016 as a variable. We've got also the log, we also use log consumption, and there is also a correlation between fixed effects and error component. As far as estimates, we have two goals to achieve mainly. First of all, in introducing life cycle elements for the future, and also correct for income endogeneity And we will do that by including an instrumental variable. Then if Chiara can move on to the next slide, but I will ask you to get back. So these are the estimates on consumption. As you can see, we've got QY, which is a decile of income. We also included the logarithm of financial wealth, and also the negative coefficient of retired persons that reflects Italian retirement consumption puzzle. In other words, that elderly people save more than young people. This is well known in literature. But if we can get back again to the previous slide, as far as alignment is concerned, here there is a rather relevant element represented by the fact that the propensity to consumption coming out of the estimates that we just looked at, well, they are very different compared with the values that we can find in national accounting data from Istat. This is also a rather well-known result in literature, and here I included reference to the work of economists from the Bank of Italy who have analyzed this discrepancy between the saving rates coming from the SHIY data and what Istat gives us in terms of data. Now we decided to align ourselves to, in the case of saving, to the Istat data. So data amounted to 10.5% in 2015 now. So let us move on to the second focus concerning the choice of financial investments. So basically in our model, there are 4 types of possible investments, financial investments. So from a modeling and econometric standpoint, it is a rather complex choice because you need to model for the possible investment in one of these 4 forms of financial activities, but also try and understand how much to the overall financial wealth is invested in a specific activity. At the moment, our methodology is based on 2 steps. First of all, an estimation of the ownership, and one concerning the ratio over the total, which we also base on the SHIW. An aspect to highlight is that we, among the variable concerning the investment decision, we include the financial literacy level of the household, of the bread earner, which is based on score based on questions concerning the financial world. So our next steps from an econometric standpoint are no doubt focused on including dynamic models, dynamic components, persistence of the financial choice, and then trying to include simultaneous or structural equation modeling, being able to choose concurrently several types of financial activities. Now let us continue to conclude by looking at preliminary simulation results. Let us begin by illustrating wealth inequality, which here we have looked at with the Gini index. So the blue line grows for the period net wealth, except for the first years in the simulation. This is led by what happens to house wealth, which is the green line, whereas what is quite unique is the wealth inequality, financial wealth inequality, the red line. So in the first half of the simulation period, we've got a reduction in this inequality, which is related to the inclusion of financial wealth in the model. So this model of the increasing in the wealth of household is related to the saving effects phenomenon. So everything that is saved is turned into financial wealth the next year. And So we can say basically that these first years of simulation have the purpose of correcting the reporting error that was to be found in SHIW data on financial wealth. If we look at the next slide, we can see how another interesting result concerns the role of capital income on total income. We can see that in the long run, because of the increase of the wealth accumulated in the model, the weight of the role of capital income increases, and this is led by a positive gap between the rate of growth of wealth and that of salaries and pensions. So from 3% in 2020 to almost 9% in 2050. So in this sense, the absence of variability in terms of returns is one of the explanations of these results. The return is almost invariably positive. There are no risk elements in the model, and this, of course, implies a value that is always positive and increasing in the role in capital income. So we can continue by looking at another interesting aspect, which was also touched on before, which is that of inheritance. So inheritance can be considered as one of the sources that explains the increase of inequality in the simulated period, because as we can see here, the inequality of inherited wealth increases considerably in the simulation period. This results, as also Riccardo was saying before earlier, is that inheritance is a phenomenon related to total demography, so the total of what is transferred on a year-to-year basis. So we can say that the increase in wealth inequality, inherited wealth inequality, is related to an increase in inequality in the wealth possessed by the elderly. And this result is also to be found in the next slide, which explains how within this model there is a total inversion in the share total wealth possessed between young people and old people in the period considered, because in 2050 we get to the fact that almost 60% of the total wealth is possessed by people who are over 65. So if we go back for a moment, Chiara, to the previous slide, we can say that as far as inheritance is concerned, an essential aspect is that probably we should improve estimates concerning the inter-vivos transfers, so those that take place before a person dies, to anticipate somehow the transfers over time, the transfers of wealth within households. If you can recap in a couple of minutes, please. I'm almost finished. So we can conclude by moving on to the last slide, since time's up. So we can sum up what the next steps may be. First of all, we start from the correction for the underreporting of financial activities in the starting year, variability in the returns of financial investments, including property, working on consumption by including life cycle components, and then a specific focus on improving the role of financial literacy in the model. So improving the evolution of financial literacy individually over time, but also in terms of alignment. And this is all I wanted to say. Thank you. And I'm giving now the floor, I don't know to whom. I will act as chair again. There are so many interesting aspects in your presentation, but as a chair, I'm afraid I have to give the floor to discussants, not in alphabetical order, but according to our leaflet. So the first is Giovanni Gallo, whom I think has got some slides. And so he's the first to take the floor. I would like to ask a discussant to stick to 10 minutes, if possible. So can you see the slides? Yes. Okay, great. So good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate as a discussant, and thank you also for the interesting presentations, very interesting presentations. And I found, I don't know it so well, but I find this model very, very interesting and having also great potential. And I have, by looking at your slides, I took notes on comments and suggestions, and I hope that some, and even though the model is very complex already, I hope that my comments can help you further improve your already excellent work. So the first comment is related to the trends that you've looked at concerning the labor market. I realize that some comments are more understandable, even though not everything is clear from my slides. And okay, I didn't understand everything from the slides, but what I wanted to know is the trends concerning the AD Silk 2004-2007. Do they coincide with those observed in the various IMPS data? Why? Because some dynamics, and I'm thinking of one, but we should evaluate all of them, particularly that of the increase of fixed-term workers over time, seems to me to be too stable in that period of time when, on the contrary, it is well known that the number of fixed-term workers has increased dramatically in Italy, particularly over that period of time considered at the beginning of your reference year period. Another question, again focusing on trends, is related to work intensity, so the number of days worked. And here too, perhaps I missed something from the slides, but not all your slides are so intuitive in the sense that consider educational level and country of birth. There is a reason, I'm sure, but it seems strange that Italians or people with a university degree work many more hours and many more days compared with those who have got a lower level of education, and compared also with foreigners, also depending on the type of occupation. I don't know if you have made comparisons or with analysis at a greater detail. And the second point, and this is perhaps the most important comment I can make, is related to the labor market transitions. And the question I've asked myself is, when I read that this microsimulation model was based on crossing Silk data and IMPS data, I would have expected, particularly in connection to evolutions in the labor market transitions, that you would look at what happens in administrative data, and then in the case of people interviewed in 2004, 5, and so on, you know the past, you know the present, and you also know their future up until 2017. So I was wondering why you decided to impute beyond the forecast, impute these transitions rather than start from administrative data and then perhaps make a forecasting based on those data. But perhaps I missed something, and somehow I also had the same doubt because I work with administrative data and those in particular. So I was wondering, as also Mr. Cacciotti from the Ministry of Finance was wondering, so if you have assessed to what extent the occupational history that emerged from Silk, you have the same person on Silk for a maximum of 4 years concerning the rotational groups of Silk. So I was wondering, do they speak the same language, in the sense, do they tell you the same things or not? And the last thing I wanted to say concerning the labor market transitions is, do you expect, so you expect students to start working, and I was wondering where. So have you assumed in your model if they can find a job outside, let's say a student who comes from the south of Italy who comes from Sicily or Apulia, I don't know, and he finds a job in northern Italy. And I wanted to know if this is a detail that you considered. And in general, and this is also something that comes up also in one of my comments, and if you consider internal migration across Italy. As far as estimates, I don't have much to comment on because of what I said before, in the sense that it would be best to base you on administrative data rather than imputations. But beyond this, what I wanted to highlight is the fact that it's okay what Chiara said concerning using only variable or using mainly variables that are simulated by the model because of internal consistency. But there are also variables such as region of residence, level of urbanization. This is perhaps an additional piece of information that you can extract from administrative data that are relevant variables in terms of accessing the labor market and also in terms of income definition, but that at the moment are not present. As to the wealth module, here too I've got a couple of questions, but again, perhaps because I did not understand something. So you correct in terms of underreporting, but then what happens concerning those who in silk had a financial wealth equal to 0? Do you correct the misreporting and the underreporting, or just the underreporting? And so can you specify something about this? And if so, what hypotheses were made, and also in connection to what was already said? While concerning household consumption, the only doubt I have is that it's not so much because it's wrong per se, but because it increases the uncertainty of estimates. The fact that you, in order to estimate household consumption, you use a variable which was already imputed. So I was wondering if perhaps by using the richness of information on silk, well, in silk you don't have information on consumption, but there are many proxy information that can tell you something about saving propensity, such as, for instance, beyond the educational level, also tenure status and income capitals. And another thing, and I don't like to quote myself, but because you were speaking about the pension reform, choosing what to do with one's severance pay, pension funds or the company, and the role of financial illiteracy was quoted. In this work I published in 2018 with Professor Van Soest and Professor Torricelli, by analyzing that reform, we saw that financial literacy has got a secondary role in Italy that is surpassed, exceeded by the sector or a number of people in a company, the level of trade unionization, the level of education or geographical area. Additional comments, well, they do not, well, they are related to your presentation, but in general, they are addressed to the model in general and also the panel. And this is related also to what Maria Luisa Maitino said earlier. Representativeness is preserved at the household level, but when you speak about the labor market, obviously the analysis dimension comes to an analysis of individual levels, and I was wondering if representativeness is also granted at the individual level. So in this connection, this may explain some of the strange trends that you sometimes notice in the labor market over time. The second aspect, which is more relevant perhaps, is that following calibration, systematically you reduce or lose the number of households at the top income levels or top wealth levels. And I was wondering if this is what you actually want to do. So it is acceptable to refer to known data, but through Silk, you've got the opportunity of correcting for underreporting of tax evasion. And by doing so, you if you do continue to do this, you will miss this chance. As far as future implementations are concerned, it's very interesting to connect with the IRA registers. But again, in Italy, what is very important is internal migration, which is and should be included in the microsimulation model, dynamic microsimulation model. And the last point concerns the number of graduated employed workers. What I saw from panel 1 is that there was an increase in 2014 because, as we read in literature, university became a sort of a shelter when the economic crisis erupted. So those who entered university in 2009 finished university in 2014. So I was wondering if this trend was noticed, that one of the economic crises that took place in Italy between 2008 and 2009. So considering long-term forecasts, if you have considered this, you should consider, in my opinion, the possibility of introducing an increase of this type also in relation to the COVID pandemic, because probably also following COVID, many students that have finished high school, rather than entering the labor market, also because it is very difficult to do so now, have decided to enroll in universities. So my speech ends here. Thank you. Thank you, Giovanni. If the authors are okay with this, we could collect questions and then a final Q&A answers at the end. Otherwise, it would take long. I would like now to give the floor to Paolo, and I want to thank Giovanni for sticking to the 10 minutes time he had been allotted. So I'm giving the floor to Achari. If you've got